Wanted to say a few words about endangered languages, but hey, I finally got a copy of Chen's book. Talking to 101 people who work in bookstores who have never heard of that book, finally came to a conclusion. I exaggerate only slightly. All right. You know, I had an interesting conversation just yesterday with someone whose first language is Hokkien. I guess I could say, I could make two lists of languages. One list being languages that I have studied, and one being languages that I tried to study. On that second list, I would include Hokkien. I tried to study that language in formal university programs. I spoke to professors in England, Canada, the US, and of course in Taiwan. To make a long story short, it turned out to be impossible. I did enough research on it to be annoying. And some of the illustrations and diagrams from that work are posted on my blog, and they actually still get a lot of readers compared to anything I've ever worked on, because there are a lot of people who grew up speaking that language, and when they search on the internet, they barely find a trace of it, especially if they're searching in English, of course. It is a language that's disappearing. It is a language that is endangered now. And just yesterday I had a conversation with someone whose parents and grandparents spoke that as their native language, but she, in the younger generation, grew up being educated only in the languages that had a chance of making money, and those are primarily Standard Chinese, aka Modern Standard Mandarin, and English. I was having the conversation with her in English. And like many discussions of endangered languages, it started with her having the outlook that no, this language wasn't endangered. It was still spoken in many places, and that if I knew more about it, I would realize that it's still vibrant in this place and that place and so on. After just a few minutes, she completely switched her perspective on the matter and was agreeing with me that yes, this language was endangered, and yes, it would probably disappear completely within the next 100 years as her grandparents' generation disappeared. And when I showed her the illustrations from my own website, from my blog, she remarked with amazement many times she had never seen the language written. She had never seen it studied. She had never seen it formally taught. And I said to her very simply, if you have a language that nobody is teaching, that nobody is reading, that nobody is writing, that's when it will disappear in the next 100 years. You have, very simply, all the ingredients there for language extinction. But you also have the awareness on her part, as someone whose family were traditionally native speakers of this language. She has the awareness that they made a choice. Their family, and more broadly their people, chose, not in a circumstance of being conquered and forced at the end of a bayonet, the way the British Empire operated in Australia, in Canada, and many other places in the world. But they made a choice to switch to languages that had a better chance of earning money for the younger generation in the future. A conscious and deliberate choice to let the language fade out of use in their own family. And she remarked several times that it was sad, and she had never thought about it before. She had never thought about how sad it was that she was herself a member of the last generation to know this language, and her own ability in the language, of course, is limited to a few isolated words and phrases, and that she's going to witness this, fade out into nothing. And whatever significance the language had for the history of the world, whatever potential it could have had for the future, is going to fade out. But a language like Minnan, a language like Hokkien, is at the opposite extreme from languages that are indigenous to Canada, probably indigenous to Australia and other examples. There was a time when Hokkien was actually a very active international language. It still has radio programs giving the news and conversation, what have you. It still has television news. In the very recent past, still today, they have some pop songs. but they used to have movies, music, love songs. It was a pop language, and it crossed international frontiers. It's definitely a language that united a whole kind of semicircle of the Chinese-speaking world, from the port of Xiamen down to Malaysia, Taiwan, Singapore. Singapore used to have a huge population speaking Minnan, and today it's really disappeared. Singapore made a conscious decision to transition to just standard Chinese and English among the Chinese population. You know, for a language with the sort of history that Minnan has, the decision consciously made to switch to other languages, both at the level of the individual family and at the level of local governments like Singapore, and you know, with policies that are not carried out with swords and guns, not through brute force, is very, very different from the historical experience of the Cree or Ojibwe, what have you. Within Canada, when I spoke to people whose heritage was Cree, Cree was maybe the only language large enough for people to have that delusion that no, there are plenty of people who speak Cree fluently. No, if you say it's endangered, you're wrong. You don't know what you're talking about. And very often, if you just talk to them about it for a couple of minutes, they would make the same flip. They would make the transition to agreeing with you and realizing, no, look, I just never thought about it before. Yeah, right, the language really is in danger. And they would think about all the things that a vibrant language would have going for it, and what's missing for Cree, and what the future might hold. But Cree is big enough and it's spread out enough geographically that some people will refuse. They'll just get dug in and say no. And they'll point to how much of the map, in theory, has Cree heritage and say no, Cree is strong and vibrant, and the language can't be disappearing from the world. I've never had that experience, even with speakers of Anishinaabe, language we call Ojibwe in English. Maybe because Ojibwe is spread out on both sides of the Canadian-US border, maybe because so much of Ojibwe is spoken in areas that are more densely populated in terms of contact with English. I don't know what the factors are. I've always found that they're much more aware of how perilous and delicate the situation of their language is, how close it is to extinction. I have written a bit about language extinction before. I wrote an informal article in a very informal publication, a sort of journal for endangered language researchers and enthusiasts and so on. And you know, one of the things I emphasized in that article, which may seem like an unusual or unpopular point to make, is that when you're researching these endangered languages, you have to respect that choice when you meet people who have made the choice. Now, I'm not saying by any means that native Cree speakers had a free choice to switch to English or what have you. Although you will meet individuals who tell you that they did. They say, yeah, you know, my grandparents spoke Cree, my parents spoke Cree, but I decided I only wanted to study English. I wanted to go to university. I wanted to get ahead. And they'll sometimes tell you that they have a brother or sister who cared more about traditional religion, traditional language, tradition in general. Some people, once in a while you meet people who consciously made a decision. So I think the role of an outsider, of a researcher, even of a political activist, can never be seeing the future of the language as an obligation for people who happen to be born into those circumstances. I think the tremendously important thing is to facilitate the minority of people who are passionate about creating a future for their native language. If, hypothetically, there were only 2% of Cree people in all of Canada who wanted to work hard to create a future for the Cree language, it would be imperative, it would be tremendously important to facilitate the efforts made by those 2% of people. And even at the level of social networking, to get them to meet each other and have conferences and cooperate and collaborate. Because those 2% of people, their work, will absolutely determine whether or not any future generation, whether it's 2%, 10%, or 50%, has the option to participate in that language, that heritage, that culture.